Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing 2021 Sharks Award possibilities. Basically, the way I will be looking at this would be if in 5 months from now I hadn't watched any Sharks games or any NHL at all, and you were to tell me at the end of the season that a Sharks player had won each of these 6 awards, this would be the Sharks player who I would most assume would actually have won it. I'm not saying any of these Sharks players are actually going to win. It's actually, it's been a while since a Sharks player actually won an individual award like this, and so especially with how the Sharks look this past season, it seems kind of far-fetched. But if in 5 months you told me a Sharks player won the Art Ross, this is who I would think. And starting off with that award, I have Tomas Hertl leading the way, with a close second being Logan Couture. And I think what it would really come down to between these two forwards is which of them ends up spending more time with the two big wingers that the Sharks do have, which are of course Meier and Kane. You see, the Sharks top 6 is comprised of these top 2 centers, Hertl and Couture, and then 2 strong wingers, Meier and Kane. The other 2 players in the top 6 are LeBanc, who is, I guess, pretty good, as well as Ryan Donato, who is a bit of an unproven quantity here in San Jose. So it is possible that Bob Booner for the Sharks decides to split up both Meier and Kane, and for instance run a first line of Couture, Meier, and then let's say LeBanc, and then a second line of Hertl, Kane, and Donato. But it is also very possible that Booner decides to put both Meier and Kane together on a line with one of Couture and Hertl, at which point whichever centerman gets both of those wingers would likely benefit much more from it, and would likely end up being the player who would lead the team in points. From this perspective, I do think that Hertl has the very slight edge offensively over Couture. We saw just a couple of years ago, it was actually Brent Burns who led the Sharks in points with 82 points in 82 games. But after that, Tomas Hertl was second place with, I believe, 76 points. And so I don't have very much reason to believe that Couture, who is, not necessarily old, but is getting older, while Hertl is still, I would say, in the prime of his career. I don't really see any reason why Hertl would finish below Couture as long as both these players play every single game of the 56-game season. Next is the Hart Memorial, and this is for the MVP of the team for the Sharks. And I'm not actually going with the player who I predicted might get the most points, which is Hertl. I'm actually going a bit off the board here with a defenseman, Erik Carlson. So of course, much has been talked about with Erik Carlson. His first 2 years in San Jose have been very much up and down. He's on an $11.5 million contract that he signed the previous offseason, and he didn't live up to it this past year. He got injured at some point, and it just didn't go all that well. But Carlson has said that this is the first year with San Jose that he's actually going to be 100% healthy. And so right now, I'm sort of banking on that. In my bold predictions video, I had predicted that Erik Carlson would have a big bounce back year, and if you had told me that a Sharks player had won the Hart Memorial, this would likely imply that the Sharks had made the playoffs. And I feel as though, considering Erik Carlson is a big name player on San Jose, he is a player that the voters are very familiar with his time in Ottawa. He's won multiple James Norris, and so people, when they look at the Sharks and if they see Erik Carlson having a fantastic year and the Sharks have made the playoffs and he is worthy of a Hart Memorial trophy, I feel as though Carlson would be the one to get it. The runner-up I would have in that case would be Martin Jones. It's really the only other way that I would see the Sharks actually being able to get a Hart Memorial trophy would be if the goaltending just performs superbly well and the Sharks manage to make the playoffs with that. It'll be something I talk a bit more about with the Vezina, but in the end, while a defenseman, it's been a while since they've won a Hart Memorial, if I'm not mistaken, since, Chris Pronger in the early 2000s. I have Erik Carlson for this one. And sort of consequentially, when we come to the James Norris, which is the best defenseman in the league, and so the best defenseman on the Sharks, I have Erik Carlson as well, of course, with Brent Burns trailing right behind him. The logic here for me with Erik Carlson is, again, that guarantee that this is his first year with the Sharks, that he is playing 100% healthy, which means I can't really predict that he's going to have necessarily a bad season, because he was a player who was just just so skilled before. When you take a look at Brent Burns, yes, 2 years ago he was a point per game player, which is very impressive for a defenseman, but this past season it was a pretty significant downturn in terms of production for Burns. And was this because that the Sharks in general were just terrible last season, or was this because that the age of Brent Burns is beginning to catch up to him? He will be 35 this coming season, turning 36 about halfway through it. And so it is easier for me to predict Erik Carlson, who is, certainly on the wrong side of 30, but still relatively in his prime, I guess, or right near the end of it. It is easier for me to predict that Carlson's going to have a bounce back year at 100% healthiness, compared to me saying a 35 or 36-year-old Brent Burns, after a down year, is going to be able to bounce back and have a spectacular Norris caliber season. It's not something that I'm saying is impossible to happen, but I just find that the Erik Carlson situation is just a slightly more likely. The next award that I have here is the Selkie. This, of course, going to the forward who sort of shows the best defensive style game with him. And of course, the Selkie, historically has been mostly given to a player who exhibits strong offensive capabilities while also being very well known for his defense. So players like Kessler when he was very strong offensively, or players like Taves, players like Couturier, players like Kopitar when he was getting 80-90 points. And so realistically, the only two players, especially since it mostly goes to centermen, the only two players on the Sharks who are actually sort of in the running for this award would be both Couture and Hertl. And while I had Hertl edging Couture out in terms of points, I find that Couture does have that edge defensively, especially among the voters. Couture is normally not in the top 3 or top 5 of the Selkie, but he's normally finding himself within the top 10, at least in the past couple of years. Couture is certainly the player, especially as the captain, who the Sharks sort of rely on in certain tense defense situations. For instance, if the Sharks had to kill a 5-on-3, up a goal trying to defend the lead, the Sharks, the one forward they'd probably put on is Logan Couture in that situation. So it certainly shows that the Sharks do really rely on him defensively, and he gets all the matchups against the opposing team's top players, and so he would be the one to take this award. When it comes to the Vezina, for most teams in the league, the Vezina would probably be a very straightforward award to give. It would just be to that team's starting goaltender. For instance, if I had done this entire sort of exercise with the Tampa Bay Lightning, most of these awards would have been rather straightforward. They have one top defenseman with Hedman, one top goaltender with Vasilevsky, but the situation that the Sharks are in, having picked up Devan Dubnyk this past off-season, actually makes it so that while I still am edging out Jones because he sort of likely has the priority and the privilege here of being this longtime Sharks goaltender for a few years, so he will have the edge at least at the beginning of the season. For instance, the 1A, 1B situation, Jones will be the 1A at the start. It is still somewhat interesting to evaluate, especially with how the schedule is constructed, where you will basically be playing the same team twice in a row each and every time. So the Sharks will play 2 games against Los Angeles, then 2 games against Anaheim, 2 games against St. Louis, 2 games against Minnesota, blah, 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 blah. And at times even playing a consecutive 4 games against specific teams. It actually wouldn't be that much of a surprise if, for instance, Jones would be given the first start of that back-to-back, and then Dubnyk would be given an opportunity against the same team. And we sort of see that happen multiple times. So while I do think Jones might get a couple extra games than Devan Dubnyk, it will likely end up being even, which is why I have Jones ending up on top in this regard. And I should also point out that while normally I would say that playing only about half of your team's games would exclude you from being nominated for the Vezina, we saw just a couple of years ago Robin Lehner, with just over 40 games played on the season, basically splitting time with Thomas Greiss on the Islanders, end up getting nominated for the Vezina. So who knows what is actually sort of allowed at this point. And the final award here is the Calder Memorial to the best rookie in the league. And so, the Sharks don't necessarily have much rookie talent. And honestly, if you had told me the Sharks had won all 6 of these awards, the one that I would be the least likely to believe you on would be the Calder. I just don't really see any Sharks rookie necessarily making that big of a splash this coming season. And so the only player who I would actually sort of potentially see happening would be Ryan Merkley. Again, this is not to say that Merkley is even going to play more than a couple of games this coming season. This is not to say Merkley is going to, have a good rookie year, even if he doesn't win the Calder. This is just to say that this is probably the Sharks rookie who might have the greatest chance of actually making a dent compared to the strong rookie talent all around the league. The only runner-up that I could come up with here was Shemalevsky, but there's a few other ones, I guess. Chekovich, Blickfeld, who might actually get a relatively consistent spot on the roster this coming season. But again, I just don't really see any of those making their mark. So if you told me that a Sharks rookie had won the Calder after Merkley, I'd probably say, well, you're probably lying to me. But that will do it for this exercise here. There are obviously a few awards that I didn't include. For instance, the Lady Byng, which is sort of a weird award where it usually goes to the player with the most offensive capabilities, but also the least amount of penalty minutes. Then, of course, awards like the Jack Adams or the GM of the Year, which are very straightforward for the Sharks. It would just be their head coach or their GM. But in the end, as I said, the Sharks, they don't necessarily get all too much individual hardware for themselves. Really, the only trophy that matters is the Stanley Cup, and while the Sharks haven't yet gotten that, maybe that will be something that they can try for this season. We'll see. Class dismissed.